Chapter 23. Word arrives in black. I woke up early the next morning, still in my clothes from the day before. As was my habit, I slung my rifle onto my back before leaving the tent. Before I could stop myself, I crept over to Rose's tent, unzipped the doorway not more than an inch, and peeked inside. She was alone, curled in her fetal sleeping position on her bedroll, and I sighed. Thank God. I tiptoed out of the camp, not wanting to run into anyone yet and have to answer the "where were you last night?" or "why'd you storm away?" questions. "Hey, French, over here." Halfway up the incline on the westward-facing hill, Clarence held up his hand above his head to get my attention. He was with Meg in general and a few other men I didn't recognize. They were all wearing shades of green and brown, and two of them had on leafy branches stuck through their hats. "You got your gun on ya?" Clarence shook my hand and nodded at the barrel gun on my shoulder, and I nodded. "All right then, let's go. Hunting day." Meg clapped me on the back and smiled, happy to see me there so early. I didn't want to tell him that it had been a fluke, that I'd fallen asleep in fits and spurts and gotten woke up when I couldn't force my wandering mind to stay stationary anymore. I spent the day in complete silence, trying to emulate the grace of the older men through the woods. Out here, there was water. You could smell it in the air. The more north we got, the more life was left in the woods. I inhaled big. "Closer you get to the coast," Clarence whispered, pointing out east, west, and then north, "the more water's left there that can be drunk. The middle grounds," he made a hand stiff with a striking motion. "Nothing. It's like where a bomb landed and the poison's leached into the banks. Everything's gone in all directions till you get further out." I didn't know what to say. I knew that had been Clarence's traditional territory. "Sorry," was all I could manage. And if he heard me, he didn't let on. "All we need is the safety to return to our homelands, and then we can start the process of healing." I was confused. How can you return home when it's gone? Can't you just heal out here? Meg and General gave each other knowing looks, and Clarence was patient in his answer. "I mean, we can start healing the land. We have the knowledge, kept through the first round of these blasted schools, from before that, when the visitors first made their way over here like angry children, throwing tantrums. When we heal our land, we are healed also." And then he added, "We'll get there. Maybe not soon, but eventually." A high whistle came through the trees, and General pulled me to the ground with him. I was frantic. Was it the recruiters? I tried to claw my gun strap to pull the weapon into my hands to get ready, and on the other side of me, Meg turned around and put a finger to his lips, shushing my small noises. I heard footsteps, a deep echo in the ground, and then branches breaking. Finally, there was silence and then another whistle, this one shorter. From around me came the sudden sounds of breath, and I'd realized that we'd all been holding ours. Then movement as everyone scrambled to their feet. "Was it recruiters?" I asked out loud. "Did they get anyone?" General answered, No, little brother. That was the scouts letting us know they had an animal in sight, one that was the right age to be taken. Sounds like they got it too." I coaxed my heart back into a normal rhythm and followed the group to where they had indeed taken down a good-sized buck. Meg was preparing the ceremony when I got there to send it off in a good way. We allowed the deer to take his dreams with him so that he had all the magic he would need to find the next world. We returned mid-afternoon as heroes. I was more than a little smug, trundling down the hill, helping to maneuver the weight of the full-grown buck on the travois that we strapped together out of branches and sinew. Even though I'd done nothing but tag along and then panic when the kill was actually made, still, I was there. I was damn near giddy when I saw the look on Derek's face as we passed by where he was leg wrestling with his friends. He had his shirt off and tucked into his back pocket, and I couldn't help but notice the definition of his muscles. I flexed under my sweater. "Uncle, I told you to wake me up," he whined, jogging alongside us to speak. "I shouldn't have to wake you up. You should be awake and ready, like the rest of the men. Like French here." I tipped an imaginary hat in his direction and watched the color blossom in his cheeks. He stopped following us, and we made our way to the outdoor kitchen near the mouth of the cave. "Oh, French, that's a beautiful buck." It was Rose. She ran over from the clothes-washing area and put her hand on my arm. It made me shiver, and I had to try real hard to remember why I was angry with her. But once I had the image of her and Derek, the dink, two-stepping right in front of me, I pulled away from her. "Yeah, why don't you go watch Derek wrestle over there?" I pointed with my lips. "I'm sure he'd love to have a cheerleader." Her face fell, and I started to feel flustered. "What are you doing, Francis?" She said in a low, since there were others around. "Why don't you just call me French? Only people I respect can call me Francis. I couldn't stop myself. I wasn't even sure how much of this I meant. She grabbed me by the elbow and led me through the kitchen and around the perimeter of the hill, back towards our camp. When we reached the first tents, I shook loose, and she turned on me. What the hell's your problem? She was only 6 inches from my face, and I could see anger flash in her dark eyes. What do you mean, what's my problem? I'm not the one who's mooning after some jerk with a drum. It was louder than I wanted to be, and she flinched. You're the jerk around here. You wouldn't even talk to me yesterday, and you expect me to just follow you around or something? She pursed her lips together when she was done, like she had struggled to keep back some words. Oh, I'm sorry I can't be at your beck and call all the time. I wasn't sure why I'd said it. It's not like she actually expected that. I even screwed up my face and flounced my hands about, as if imitating her snobby behavior. Well, this managed to unpurse her lips. You know what, French? You're different. At first I thought it was because of Riri and Minerva, but no, you're even more different here. Her voice broke on the names a bit, but she took a breath and kept going. I should just leave. After we find Minerva, I should just go. I don't want to stay around here when you're being such an ass. I regretted this next line forever. What? And leave your new boyfriend Derek behind? Whatever. Don't expect me to chase after you. Her eyes filled with tears, and I was ashamed. So ashamed that I dropped my head and I looked at the ground, so that all I saw of her retreat was the movement of her shoes as she took off, sobbing. I waited until I couldn't hear her, until I was able to move my heavy limbs and drooping head. I couldn't go to my tent. I was scared to be alone in there right now. So I trudged the path back to the cave, past the celebrations in the outdoor kitchen, up the corridor and into my father's room. I flopped face first on his bed and stayed that way until he came in an hour or so later. He rustled about for a few minutes and then, satisfied that I was awake, began to speak. Did I ever tell you how I ended up in the city? I shook my head. I couldn't remember even hearing stories about my dad outside of him being my dad. I hadn't really considered him anything other than that. I ran away. I should have sat up, showed some interest, but I just couldn't. I heard his calloused palms rub at his mustache, an old habit. The sound made me feel safe and very young. Yep, when I was 13, I was 13 when I decided. That young? Uh-huh. I remember that day, too. It rained in the morning, but the sun came out after lunch. I tilted my head towards his voice, so that I held my face in the palm of one hand, listening. Painted wood, when you leave it alone, works itself out. Like it needs to be back to an honest shade. It'll fade blue to skinny green. The church where I went that day, it had rubbed itself gray. It made the birch around it seem real stark by comparison, like bone splinters sticking out of the ground like that. He settled his weight on the bed beside me and continued. I remember the old people used to say about the church was that it was a medicine house. I sat there that day on top of my backpack in the aisle between 2 rows of pews so rough they'd cut your legs if you wore shorts to service, and thought, this doesn't look like no medicine house to me. They used to say that men who came in left as something entirely different, something with hands that wouldn't obey natural law, and hearts heavy and empty at the same time. Me, I needed something to change. Maybe that's why I went out there to that church. Nothing seemed solid to me anymore. Like everything was a drawing of what it was supposed to be, you know? I felt like my hands would pass right through the door when I showed up. But that day my hands needed to touch something real. He extended his arthritic fingers out in front of him, throwing shadows over the bedspread. That church sat in the woods behind our rec center. It was like a small comma in a long sentence. It was shallow and narrow, not much bigger than a portable where Miss Gunther taught English with Reader's Digest magazines. When it was used, it held about 20 people or so, that's at best. 15 if the Boyer boys were at the service. Me, I didn't give a shit about God or Jesus one way or another, but I knew that this would be the last place they'd look. If ma mère decided to get up that day, and if she knew me anymore, she might come. I didn't care. She'd be better off talking to the wood bugs outside. She'd get a better response. They wouldn't think up new swears to yell at her or jab her with sticks sharpened by Grandpa's old hunting knife. But then, I might not either. But you could never tell by then. I couldn't guarantee anything. His voice sounded far away. I turned so I was facing him now. He spoke to a spot over my head and nearer to the wall, like this was a story that was written in the space between us. The rages came as at the weirdest of times, eating Cheerios, watching music videos, hanging out. A garbage can got set on fire outside the school. I couldn't even tell you for sure it was me. He kind of laughed there, a laugh with no joy in it. Then I thought, geez, what if it isn't my mom that finds me here? The thought made the back of my knees prickle. What if it was one of them pickup trucks on a dirt bike in a shiny government black car, one hand outstretched, the other hand hidden behind a back? And his body went rigid. I read the stress in the veins that popped ancient braille into his neck. His eyes looked at something I couldn't see. And what was there even to keep me safe? What, a broken crucifix maybe? My pocket knife? I was 13 then, not old enough to fight a grown man. So I did the only thing that came to mind just then, something I'd done only once or twice before shit got real bad. I got to my knees, pressed my fingers so tight the skin around my bitten nails ached, and I prayed. I needed an answer. I prayed and I prayed, closing my eyes so tight I saw constellations on my eyelids, and I listened for an answer. I listened, and I heard a bird. I heard a cricket, and I heard some kids yelling for someone to pass the ball. And then there it was, the answer. It was the smooth swoosh of metal and rubber on the Trans-Canada, like a ribbon of tar over the bush, over old Highway 11. So I nodded my thanks to the blind Christ and threw my backpack over one shoulder. I was scared, but more scared of staying. I knew at least on the other side there could be a place, any place where hands couldn't reach. We were quiet for a minute. He was so still it frightened me, and then he pulled away from wherever he had gone and he smiled at me. I went to the city after that, bummed around for a bit, tried to stay away from the cops and then the military when they took over. I found your mom there. She was the most beautiful girl in the world, and mean as dirt when she wanted to be, but not to me. He smiled real big then, and there was joy in that. I was so happy, French. She made me feel like I was important, like captain of industry or a scientific genius, and that was just from the look she'd give me when I was doing nothing special at all. It was amazing, really. Now that's medicine. Don't need no damn house to keep it in. He nodded his head as if convincing me of the truth of it. Then from out of the cave came a shuffle of feet down the corridor and voices getting louder in the valley. Jean, Astum. It was Clarence shouting for my dad. We both stood, and I helped him up and out, and I slung my rifle forward as we made our way down the hall and into the valley. Cheeboy popped out of the shadows as if he'd been waiting there all along on a spring. They're on the move, tomorrow. It was an old man in black robes, waving his arms while he shouted, half out of breath. The sound of air being punched out of a gut came from Mig. He'd come from the kitchen to stand behind me. Priest, he managed. I raised my rifle so he was in my sight. Cheeboy rushed towards the man, lowering his shoulder in tackle position. French, wait, Cheeboy! It was my dad, yelling with his hand up towards us. Cheeboy stopped his charge midway. This is Father Carroll. He's our guy on the inside. I lowered the gun and turned instead to brace Mig, who was bent over with his hands on his knees, pale with the shock of seeing a school official. Carroll has news about Minerva. The old man sighed his relief and tried again. I'll be moving her tomorrow morning. They'll be taking her to the airstrip just west of here to fly her to the capital. My heart sank. The capital? How would we get there on time? Well, I guess that's it then. I kicked a rock that skidded to a stop just in front of the priest. No, son, my dad was smiling. That's great news. I squinted at him. How do you figure? It was Father Carroll, confident he wasn't about to be mowed down by a bunch of angry Indians, who answered, Because, my dear boy, they must pass right by here on the Trans-Canada to get from Espanola to the airstrip. They'll be bringing her right to us.